Have you ever noticed how people around you react when you don't immediately respond to a message? Or when you decide not to show up to that gathering you always accept without questioning? There's a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but profoundly revealing in the atmosphere of relationships. People begin to move differently around you, as if a gravitational force that once kept them in predictable orbit had suddenly altered. Franz Kafka, with his surgical perception of the human condition, understood something that most of us take a lifetime to discover. When we stop being available, when we break from the automatic pattern of saying yes to everything and everyone, something fundamental transforms not just in us, but in the entire social fabric that surrounds us. Imagine for a moment yourself walking down a familiar street, that same street you've traveled for years, always at the same time, always with the same destination. The people who pass by you have already internalized your presence, your predictability, your constant availability for the small requests, the small demands, the small sacrifices we no longer even register as choices. You've become part of others' emotional landscape, a reliable constant in their equations of convenience. But then, on an apparently ordinary day, you decide to take a different street. Or better yet, you decide not to leave the house at all. You decide for the first time in a long while to be unavailable. What happens in this moment of rupture is more than a simple change of routine. It's an awakening to an existential truth that Kafka explored in his deepest works. Our constant availability isn't generosity, it's a subtle form of imprisonment. The feeling of always being at others' disposal is like carrying a phone that never stops ringing, a bell that constantly echoes in our consciousness. We answer because we believe this is the definition of being a good person, of being loved, of being necessary. We build our identity on the unstable foundation of others' approval, and our availability becomes the currency with which we buy our place in the world. Kafka knew this intimately. His characters frequently find themselves trapped in bureaucratic and social labyrinths, not because external forces compel them, but because they've internalized the need to always be available to the demands of systems that never truly recognize them as complete human beings. The absurd isn't in the situations themselves, but in our inability to recognize that we have the power to simply not be available. When we finally make this decision, this radical decision not to always be at everyone's disposal, we discover something simultaneously liberating and terrifying. People survive quite well without our constant availability. The problems that seem to urgently need our intervention find other solutions. The crises that made us feel indispensable resolve themselves or reveal themselves to be less critical than we imagined. And we, for the first time, begin to experience something Kafka described as the strange freedom that comes from not being necessary in the way we thought we were necessary. This discovery invites us to dive deeper into the unexplored territory of our own existential autonomy, where each no we pronounce becomes a yes to something more authentic and true. The first thing we notice when we stop being always available is how the world doesn't collapse. This perception arrives with the force of a revelation, carrying with it a disconcerting mixture of relief and melancholy. For years, perhaps decades, we've built an internal narrative where our constant presence, our readiness to answer calls and solve others' problems, was fundamental to the functioning of the universe around us. We sincerely believed that our absence would cause waves of chaos, leave people helpless, create impossible voids to fill. Kafka deeply understood this illusion of indispensability. In his letters and diaries, he frequently explored how we imprison ourselves in roles we ourselves create, becoming slaves to versions of ourselves that exist only in others' perception. Think about those moments when you finally decided not to immediately respond to a message, or when you said no to a social invitation you would normally accept out of obligation. Initially, there's an almost physical anxiety, a sensation that something terrible is about to happen. Your mind conjures catastrophic scenarios. The person will be offended, relationships will be damaged, you'll be excluded, judged, considered selfish or insensitive. But then hours pass, days pass, and you discover that people continue with their lives. The problems that seem to urgently need your solution find other paths. Others' emotional emergencies dissipate or find other sources of support. This discovery brings a first glimpse of something Kafka knew intimately. Our constant availability, frequently serves our own fears of abandonment and insignificance more than the real needs of the people around us. The liberation from always being available reveals layers of relationships that previously remained hidden. When we stop being the automatic solution to others' problems, when we withdraw from the position of perpetual savior, relational dynamics reorganize in surprising ways. Some people, those who related to us primarily through our utilitarian function, begin to naturally drift away. There's no drama, no direct confrontations, simply a gradual decrease in the frequency of contacts, a subtle coldness in interactions. This discovery can be initially painful, as it reveals how many of our relationships were built on our availability as emotional commodity rather than on genuine appreciation for who we are when we're not providing services. On the other hand, relationships of a completely different quality emerge. People who previously interacted with us superficially begin to approach with genuine curiosity. There's something magnetic about the person who isn't always available, not because it's manipulation or psychological games, but because selective unavailability signals self-knowledge and self-valorization. Kafka observed this phenomenon in his own life. The more he withdrew from conventional social demands, the more he attracted people who valued him for his essential nature rather than for his utility. These new relationships operate on different frequencies. There's less urgency, more depth, less demand, and more genuine reciprocity. The process of stopping being always available also reveals how our culture is deeply invested in keeping people in states of constant availability. We live in a society that glorifies perpetual connectivity, that transforms quick responsiveness into moral virtue, that confuses being busy with being important. The technologies we carry function as invisible leashes, creating the expectation that we should always be accessible, always ready to respond, always available to others' demands. Kafka anticipated this dynamic in his works, exploring how bureaucratic and social systems prosper by keeping individuals in perpetual states of anxiety about their adequacy and availability. When we begin to establish boundaries, when we create spaces of sacred unavailability, we face not only external resistance, but our own internal resistance. We've been conditioned to feel guilt when we don't immediately attend to others' needs, to interpret our unavailability as selfishness or coldness. This guilt is particularly intense for people who built their identity on being helpful, generous, always present. Kafka understood how this guilt functions as a control mechanism, keeping us trapped in patterns that drain our vital energy and distance us from our authenticity. The guilt we feel when we say no isn't necessarily a sign that we're doing something wrong. Frequently, it's the sign that we're finally doing something right, but challenging to systems that depend on our unrestricted availability. The transformation that happens when we stop being always available operates on multiple dimensions simultaneously. There's a profound internal change, almost alchemical, that alters our relationship with ourselves and with the world. For the first time, perhaps in years, we begin to experience what it means to have time that's truly ours, mental space that isn't constantly being invaded by others' demands and expectations. This space, initially, may seem uncomfortable, even terrifying. We've been conditioned to equate personal value with utility to others, so when we withdraw from this equation, we may initially feel existential vertigo, a sensation that we've lost our anchorage in the world. But it's precisely in this zone of discomfort that something extraordinary begins to emerge. Kafka described this phenomenon as the awakening of an inner voice that had been muffled by the constant noise of external demands. When we're no longer spending our emotional and mental energy constantly reacting to others, when we create spaces of chosen silence and solitude, we begin to reconnect with aspects of ourselves that had been neglected or forgotten. Thoughts we hadn't had in years begin to surface. Dormant interests awaken. Dreams we had pushed to the background return with new urgency and clarity. This process of internal reconnection isn't always comfortable or romantic. Kafka knew that meeting oneself frequently means confronting aspects of our personality and history that we preferred to avoid. When we stop being constantly distracted by others' needs, when we no longer have the excuse of perpetual availability to flee from ourselves, we're forced to face fundamental questions about who we are, what we really want, what kind of life we want to build. This confrontation can generate significant anxiety as we discover that many of the choices we made, many of the commitments we assumed, were based more on external expectations than on authentic desires. Strategic unavailability also teaches us the crucial difference between solitude and isolation. Isolation is frequently a defensive reaction to the world, a form of protection born from fear or wound. Chosen solitude, on the other hand, is an act of self-love, a conscious decision to create space for the development of our inner life. Kafka was a master of this distinction. Though frequently described as solitary, he actively chose moments of withdrawal, not from misanthropy, but from recognizing that his creativity and mental clarity depended on regular periods of disconnection from conventional social demands. When we learn to value our own company, when we develop a rich and sustainable relationship with ourselves, our capacity to be truly available to others paradoxically expands. But now this presence comes from a place of abundance instead of lack, of choice instead of obligation. We're no longer trying to fill internal voids through external approval that comes from being constantly useful. Instead, we offer our presence and energy when we choose to do so, and this offering has a different quality, cleaner, more focused, more genuine. The relationship with time also transforms dramatically when we stop being always available. Time, which was previously a commodity constantly claimed by others, becomes a resource we manage consciously. We discover we have much more time than we imagined, not because we gained more hours in the day, but because we stopped wasting them on activities we didn't genuinely choose. Kafka observed this phenomenon in his own experience. When he began to establish clearer boundaries about his time and energy, he discovered he had capacity not only for his art, but for deeper relationships and richer experiences. The quality of our attention also changes profoundly. When we're no longer constantly dividing our attention between multiple simultaneous demands, when we no longer have that background sensation that we should be somewhere else attending to some other need, our capacity to be truly present expands. The people around us begin to notice this difference. Our conversations become deeper, our interactions more meaningful, because when we choose to be available, we're completely available, instead of being physically present but mentally fragmented between various concerns and obligations. This transformation also teaches us to recognize and value genuine reciprocity in relationships. When we're no longer offering our availability unilaterally and unconditionally, we begin to notice which relationships are truly mutual and which were based primarily on our willingness to give without expecting equivalent return. Some relationships, when tested by our new selective unavailability, reveal themselves built on exploitation dynamics that neither party had consciously recognized. Other relationships, surprisingly, flourish when we introduce more balance and healthy boundaries. Here at the midpoint of our exploration, it's worth pausing for a moment to reflect on your own experience. As you listen to these words, what situations from your life come to mind? In what relationships or contexts do you feel that your constant availability has become an expectation that perhaps no longer serves your best interests? What fears arise when you imagine establishing clearer boundaries about your time and energy? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective can illuminate aspects of this experience we haven't yet explored and create a rich conversation that benefits our entire community of people interested in living more consciously and authentically. The integration phase of this new way of being in the world presents unique challenges that Kafka explored deeply in his fiction and personal correspondence. Once we recognize our capacity for choice about our availability, once we experience the benefits of creating healthy boundaries, we face the question of how to live this new consciousness sustainably and ethically. It's not about becoming insensitive people or completely self-centered, but about finding a dynamic balance where our generosity with others flows from a place of authenticity rather than compulsion or fear. This integration requires the development of a more sophisticated form of emotional and social intelligence. We begin to distinguish between legitimate requests that deserve our attention and energy and demands that are based on habits, manipulation, or unrealistic expectations. This distinction isn't always clear or easy to make, and requires that we develop our capacity for tolerance of discomfort in ambiguous situations. Kafka was particularly skilled at navigating these murky waters. His letters show someone who could be deeply empathetic and helpful when he chose to be, but who also maintained firm boundaries when he felt his integrity or well-being were at risk. Learning to communicate our unavailability clearly and compassionately becomes an essential skill. Many people never learn to say no in a way that honors both their own needs and others' feelings. We discover it's possible to be firm without being cruel, to establish boundaries without creating enmities, to prioritize our own mental and emotional health without becoming cold or disconnected people. This effective communication frequently requires that we be more direct and honest than we were accustomed to being, which can initially generate anxiety, but ultimately results in clearer and more respectful relationships. Managing guilt continues to be a central aspect of this integration journey. Even when we intellectually recognize that we have the right not to always be available, our emotional conditioning may continue generating feelings of guilt when we exercise that right. Kafka observed that this guilt is frequently disproportionate to the actual situation. We feel as if we're committing some terrible crime when, in reality, we're simply making healthy and normal choices about how to use our time and energy. Learning to tolerate this guilt without being dominated by it, to recognize it as a sign of growth instead of evidence of misconduct, becomes a necessary daily practice. Simultaneously, we discover that our capacity to be truly available, when we choose to be, expands significantly. When we're not constantly exhausted by excessive demands, when we have emotional and mental energy because we consciously preserve it, we can offer a much richer and more useful presence in situations where our availability is genuinely necessary and appropriate. The people around us begin to value our time and attention more because they know they're not given automatically. They're offered as conscious gifts from someone who has other options. This transformation also profoundly affects our relationship with work and professional responsibilities. Many of us were conditioned to believe that professional success requires constant availability, that establishing boundaries about our time and energy in work contexts is a sign of lack of commitment or ambition. Kafka, who worked at an insurance company while pursuing his art, intimately understood the tensions between professional demands and personal integrity. He discovered that establishing clear boundaries about his availability not only protected his creativity and mental health, but frequently improved the quality of his work because he was more focused and energized during the hours he dedicated to his professional responsibilities. The practice of not always being available also teaches us to recognize and respect the natural rhythms of our energy and creativity. Many of us live as if we should operate at consistent levels of availability and productivity, ignoring the natural cycles of expansion and contraction that characterize all living systems. Kafka was deeply conscious of these rhythms. He knew when his mind was clearest for writing, when his social energy was low and he needed solitude, when his capacity to deal with external demands was compromised. Respecting these rhythms, instead of forcing constant availability, results in a more sustainable and paradoxically more productive life in the long term. The development of hobbies, interests, and personal passions frequently resurges during this integration phase. When we're no longer spending all our free energy attending to others' needs, we rediscover spaces for activities that nourish our soul in ways that have no direct relation to our utility for other people. Kafka found in writing not only a vocation, but a way of being in relationship with himself that didn't depend on external approval or recognition. These personal interests function as anchors of identity, independent of the functions we perform for others. The relationship with solitude deepens and becomes more sophisticated during this phase. Initially, we may have chosen unavailability as a way to escape excessive demands. But gradually, we discover that moments of chosen solitude become some of the most valuable and restorative of our lives. It's not a solitude of isolation or sadness, but a solitude of deep connection with ourselves, with our thoughts, with our creativity, with aspects of our experience that are unique and cannot be directly shared with others. Kafka wrote extensively about this productive and necessary solitude, describing it as the fertile ground where his most important ideas and clearest understanding of himself germinated. If you've made it this far in our journey together, this demonstrates genuine interest in living more consciously and authentically. Consider subscribing to the channel and activating notifications so you don't miss our next dives into existential territory. Your participation in this community makes a difference. The final mastery of this art of not always being available manifests in our capacity to live integrally and by choice, instead of reactively and compulsively. We reach a point where our availability or unavailability isn't determined by fears, guilt, or attempts to control how others perceive us, but by an honest assessment of our internal resources, our authentic priorities, and our commitment to our own development as complete human beings. Kafka achieved this mastery in his later years, when his correspondence shows someone who could be deeply generous and connected when he chose to be, but who also maintained sacred spaces of unavailability that protected his integrity and creativity. This mastery isn't a static state we achieve once and for all, but a dynamic practice that requires constant adjustments to the changing circumstances of our lives. There will be periods when our capacity for availability will naturally be greater, and others when we'll need to be more selective and protective of our energy. The wisdom lies in recognizing these rhythms and responding to them with flexibility instead of rigidity, with self-compassion instead of self-judgment. Kafka understood that this conscious flexibility is itself a form of integrity, being faithful to our real needs and limitations instead of to an idealized image of who we should be. When we live this way, we discover that our relationships become more honest, our contributions to the world more meaningful, and our life experience richer and more sustainable. We're no longer trying to be everything to everyone. We're no longer exhausting our internal reserves in futile attempts to control how others see us or feel about us. Instead, we offer the world our most authentic and energized version of ourselves, available when we choose to be, unavailable when we need to be, always in the process of discovering the dynamic balance that honors both our own humanity and the humanity of others. The people who truly value us learn to respect and even admire our capacity to establish healthy boundaries. They recognize that someone who knows how to take care of themselves will probably also know how to take care of others in a more sustainable and genuine way. Relationships based on manipulation, convenience, or unrealistic expectations naturally dissolve or transform, leaving space for connections based on mutual respect, reciprocity, and genuine appreciation for the totality of who we are. Perhaps the most profound discovery of this journey is that not always being available doesn't make us less loving or connected. It makes us more loving and connected in a sustainable and authentic way. When our generosity flows from abundance instead of lack, when our presence is offered consciously instead of compulsively, when our relationships are based on mutual choice instead of desperate need, we experience forms of intimacy and connection that were previously impossible. Kafka knew that true love, whether romantic, familial, or platonic, prospers when it exists between people who are capable of existing independently, who choose to be together instead of needing to be together to avoid emptiness or loneliness. The transformation that Kafka identified when we stop being always available is ultimately a transformation toward authentic freedom. Not the freedom to do what we want without considering others, but the freedom to respond to life from a place of personal integrity, to make choices based on our real values and priorities instead of on unconscious fears and conditioning. This freedom carries responsibility. The responsibility to know our limits, to communicate them clearly, to honor both our own needs and others' dignity. When we stop being always available, we discover that we change not only our way of relating to others, but our way of relating to life itself. We stop living defensively, constantly reacting to external demands, and begin living creatively, actively choosing how to invest our finite and precious energy. This is perhaps the most profound gift we can give to ourselves and to the world. A version of ourselves that is simultaneously more available and more free, more connected and more independent, more generous and wiser about when and how to exercise that generosity. Kafka's perception about the transformative power of not always being available invites us to fundamentally rethink our relationship with generosity, connection, and authenticity. In a culture that frequently confuses constant availability with virtue, that interprets healthy boundaries as selfishness, Consciously choosing when and how to be available becomes a revolutionary act of self-preservation and growth. It's no coincidence that Kafka, who struggled throughout his life with the tensions between social demands and personal integrity, produced some of the most profound and enduring works of modern literature in the spaces of unavailability he created for himself. When we finally integrate this wisdom into our daily lives, when we learn to navigate the world with clear boundaries and an open heart, we discover that life becomes not necessarily easier, but more true, more aligned with who we really are instead of who we think we should be to keep the peace or win approval. Kafka showed us that this authenticity, though sometimes lonely or challenging, is the only sustainable path to a life worth living. When we stop being always available, we don't become less human. We become more completely human, capable of offering the world not our exhaustion disguised as generosity, but our vital energy consciously directed, our chosen presence, our sustainable and true love.